Hey there, Professor Zeeb here. Welcome into the video lecture here. This time I'm going to teach you about some of the sensory declines of middle adulthood and some other changes as well. Now I'm going to warn you, this lecture can get a little depressing because we're going to talk about how the body's declining. You know, it's always kind of an eye-opening thing for people to kind of understand this, but it's the reality of being human. You know, once we hit middle age, our bodies start to kind of wear down and we're going to see some changes. So we're going to go through the senses and then look at some other body systems as well. All right, so let's take a look. We're going to start off with vision. Okay, so vision in middle age here. Really what we're finding is that the magic number for this one seems to be around 40 for most people, even though we said in the earlier stage that the beginnings are there, some of the changes start to happen. Okay, but eyes are going to change physically at around age 40, as it turns out. So for example, the lens becomes less elastic, yellow and thicker. So I don't know if you guys know your eye anatomy, but the lens is this structure that accommodates to allow us to focus on different depths. So our ability to do that, unfortunately, is affected by that. Our cornea, which is a filter, but also a focusing device in the eye, starts to lose its luster, which creates problems. And our iris, which is the colored part of the eye, starts to respond less well to light as a result. So in other words, around 40, we would sort of expect those changes to happen. You know, I think about my own life. I have to really agree with this one. I think 40, right on the dot, is when I started wearing glasses for reading and looking at my cell phone and that kind of stuff. So to me, that holds completely true. Around 40, I was right on average for that. Your eyes become less effective at adapting to sudden changes in light. Remember, this has to do with the iris, which controls the opening into the eye known as the pupil. So usually issues with the iris are related to this. So for example, if someone suddenly turned off the lights on you and your ability to adapt to that or some kind of change, we're finding that we're not as adaptive in that situation. To me, in my own life, a great example of that is if I'm outside working in the yard doing yard work, you know, it's a bright sunny day, I'm doing my yard work, and then I suddenly come in the house into a dark room. I feel like I'm blind or something. My eyes just simply don't adapt to that darker condition as readily as when I was a younger adult. So sudden changes in light seem to be a factor. The ability to focus on nearby objects decreases. So do you guys know what this is technically called? This is called farsightedness, is how most people relate to that. I always thought that was strange, but farsightedness referring to things that you can see better. So in this case, reading or looking at your cell phone, that kind of thing, things are more problematic. And that's why you see people around my age start to wear glasses or even younger at 40. So once again, this has to do with problems with the lens and the cornea, which help to focus light waves in the eye. They're just not as efficient, and some of the changes we mentioned earlier. Okay, so once again, it's pretty commonly why you see people in their 40s wearing glasses. All right, the ability to detect certain colors also change. This, once again, you could argue has to do with the lens as well as other structures. So for example, some research is showing that blue and green may be hard to discern. In other words, to tell the difference between those two colors, okay? Now keep in mind, most of these issues are not a big deal unless like the lighting is reduced and you're really having to concentrate, for example. But most of these issues are not a major problem until you get to the, you know, as you sort of progress through middle adulthood, then it becomes more problematic. Or if you're trying to read the fine print, which is frustrating sometimes, but most people find a way to sort of adapt with those. So like I said, roughly the magic number's around 40 for most people where we see some of those changes. Okay, so next we go to hearing in middle age. Like vision, the changes in hearing are pretty notable around age 40, okay? Remember, we could even draw that earlier into early adulthood. If you watched that earlier lecture, I know you did. We have found that certain pitches can be affected, but overall around age 40 is when we see those differences. So the ability to detect certain tones decreases. Remember, it's the higher pitch sounds, the ones that are higher in pitch are the ones that typically are lost first, okay? So I love how it turns out that a lot of people are taking advantage of the natural declines of adulthood. So sometimes in high school, you get these teenagers that are using their cell phone in class, and obviously you're not supposed to do that for many different reasons. And so they have certain ringtones that are in the higher pitch range. I think one of them is called the mosquito or something like that. And so if you had an older instructor like me, they would not be able to hear your cell phone ringing in class. So I always thought that was funny how the teenagers are taking advantage of our natural declines in human development. Oh, there you go. So our higher pitched sounds, I'm being facetious, of course, but the higher pitched sounds are the ones that are typically lost first, okay? In most cases, they would need to be really loud to be heard. So you may find that if you're in that scenario trying to hear something like that, you may need to turn it up kind of thing. To me, this one's really serious. To me, the most severe of some of the changes, the ability to understand human speech actually declines. And that's due to the body's ability to detect consonants, okay? So think about trying to understand what someone's saying. If you can't hear the consonants of their speech, think how difficult that would be, especially if there's background noise present. So let's say you're in a restaurant on a crowded Friday night or something, back before all the changes happen. And if there's a lot of background noise, it may be hard to follow the conversation that's happening in front of you. So like imagine how that would make you feel as a person, not being able to participate in the conversation or follow. In a way, it kind of dehumanizes you. You know, it sort of takes a little bit out of your personal life because it may be hard to hear what everyone's saying. And so therefore you have to ask them to repeat it, which can be annoying and embarrassing, that kind of thing. So just as a person, that has to hurt sometimes to know that some of that part of you is basically being lost, and it's hard to just follow simple conversations, which are, you know, you take for granted when you're younger. Hearing is one of the most stigmatized loss of the five senses. In other words, the most stereotypical losses of people get older. I think you guys can probably relate to that we often have this notion that older people can't hear and that kind of thing. So it's really, really stigmatized, unfortunately. Okay, we're gonna look at some research and data here. So here, they've looked at different types of hearing loss across the lifespan, as you can see here. So going from birth to 65 plus here on the right, and they've separated the data by male and female and so forth. And so these are the percent of people affected with hearing loss. So I want you guys to look at this data, and does anything seem kind of surprising to you? I'm gonna give you a second to kind of look at that and contemplate. Certainly we would expect it 45, 64 and older. We would expect these numbers that you're seeing here, even in this age group, because it does include the beginning of middle age after 40. But to me, the one that surprises me the most when I saw this is this group here. Whoops, guys, I'm gonna go back here. I apologize for that. The 6 to 18, you wouldn't expect 10% roughly of people to have lost their hearing, you know, before they're even an adult. So can you think of why that would be? Why would people, you know, this young be losing their hearing? Well, we think it may be due to damage of the nerves by listening to loud music and loud sounds. Like for example, if you listen to your earbuds really loudly, or if you go to concerts a lot, for example. I don't know if you guys like to go to the movies. I'm gonna sound like Grandpa Zeeb here, but those movies are so damn loud. You know, the stereo systems they have in movies today are just incredible, and it's a great experience. But at the same time, we're being bombarded by loud sounds sometimes. I think a lot of those factors may contribute to nerve damage or nerve deafness, where it's sort of overtaxing your hearings system. And, you know, like I said, naturally, we wouldn't expect these numbers here, at least in my opinion. So research does show the rate of deafness in our country, the United States here, is increasing. So that has been confirmed in research. In other words, it's going above what we would sort of expect by developmental means. Okay, next we go to olfactory, or the sense of smell. Olfaction is our scientific name for the sense of smell. And it uses something called chemoreceptors. These are specialized receptor cells that detect airborne chemicals back in the nasal passage at the back, okay? So in other words, when you're smelling something, a chemical has been released into your nose or enters into your nose, and then it triggers those nerves, which then goes to the brain. This one's kind of interesting because it's often combined with taste to the point where sometimes it's difficult to separate them in the research. They're so intertwined, right? Obviously, if you plug your nose, sometimes you can't taste things. So we think that the brain combines the sense of taste and smell into what we know as flavor. So there's a lot of kind of underpinnings and connections between those two senses, so it's hard to separate them. But more to the point, the sense of smell seems to decline slowly around age 50. It's a little bit later than vision and hearing, but then rapidly after 70. And so we'll come and we'll revisit this when we get to older adulthood, that stage. Next we go to taste, which we said is intertwined with the sense of smell. Like the sense of smell, the ability to taste begins to decline around age 50. So we see the connection with the sense of smell being lost. What type of taste receptors do you guys think are lost first? Do you think it would be the stronger, maybe like spicy, stronger taste, or the middle ones, or kind of the milder tastes? It turns out that it's the weaker tastes that are lost first. It would make sense because the really strong tastes create huge stimulation on the tongue, and of course your brain would detect that. But if it's a milder, weaker taste, we would need lots of that to kind of register, especially if the system's starting to decline. So it turns out the weaker tastes are the ones that we lose first, okay? This can be a problem because as we get older, and if we don't realize this, if we're losing our sense of taste for milder tasting foods, we may start dumping on salt and things that are horrible for us. So you have to kind of keep that in mind as a person, that your ability to taste will change as you get older. And so therefore you have to be careful about adding seasoning, which is certain seasonings, which could be unhealthy for you. So keep that in mind. All right, we're gonna go next to other body systems that are affected in middle adulthood. So we're going to start with the lungs here. We're going to see some small changes here in middle adulthood. They're not quite severe. For example, lung tissue becomes less elastic at around age 55. That's because the proteins in the lungs become less elastic, So the proteins become less elastic, and that is related to a decreased lung capacity, okay? In other words, that's your ability to move oxygen throughout the body is affected by that. Our chest walls are becoming stiffer as we get older. Now think, guys, we've mentioned how lifestyle often factors into a lot of these things, these changes we've been talking about. So unfortunately, if you're a smoker, if you started out smoking young, or you're vaping or whatever it is, chances are by the time you're a middle adult, you're really going to see the effects of that. And so your lung capacity could be affected drastically. You're setting yourself up for all those health problems that we mentioned before. So unfortunately, now those earlier lifestyle patterns may start to really catch up with you, where you may not be able to exercise appropriately, or you're losing your breath easy and that kind of thing. So think about that, guys. If you value being active and jogging and things like that, obviously you don't want to be smoking, because we're going to see the effects down the line, unfortunately. Here's some interesting research. If you do quit smoking, the good news is that you can regain some of that capacity. So the capacity could be lost, but we're finding in some cases where people quit. I don't know if you guys know anyone that's ever quit smoking. One of the hardest things to do. I'm one of those survivors that actually did it. But people that quit, we have some evidence that they do regain some of their lung capacity. So that's encouraging news, that the lungs can actually start to heal themselves to a certain extent, and it's not just completely damaged permanently. Exercise, one of the really common themes of the class that really is so good for us in many different ways. Here's another reason. Exercise is linked to better lung functioning and lower risk of lung cancer. So once again, The benefits of exercise continue with the chorus here. We really see a lot of different areas that improve or maintained by exercising. So obviously I want to encourage you to do that in your own life, in your daily life. All right, last thing we're going to talk about is sleep, something that a lot of us probably need more of at times when our lives get hectic and so forth. Unfortunately, the way we experience sleep as we get older can be disrupted and those problems can occur. So we're going to find there's more wakeful periods. Those become more frequent in our 40s, and that translates into less deep sleep, or stage 4, our deepest stage of sleep. I don't know if you guys know your stages of sleep. You've taken Psych 1, but unfortunately, if you're experiencing this, you're not getting that deep sleep that your body and your brain basically needs, okay? So that can be problematic. We also know that sleep disordered breathing and something called restless leg syndrome, also known as periodic limb movement disorder, become more prevalent with age, okay? So in other words, you may not be breathing appropriately, or the second one here is kind of what it sounds like. It's where you have the urge to move your limb or kick your leg, for example, during sleep, which disrupts your pattern and your ability to get a nice, adequate amount of sleep, unfortunately. So that's more likely to hit you after 50, for example. So we do see some of these problems become more prevalent as we get older. All right, so what's the big deal? If we're losing sleep, that doesn't affect me as a person, right? Well, it turns out it affects people in many different ways. Listen to this. Sleep deprivation, which can be caused by these two things and more, can lead to stroke. So it's pretty hardcore there. So stroke, memory impairment. So your memory is just not quite as sharp as when you're getting your night's sleep, your full night's sleep. It lowers your immune system. So research has shown that your likelihood of getting sick and ill become greater with lack of sleep. And then even cognitive decline. So they've actually linked it to cognitive decline as we get older. So some pretty heavy duty stuff there, stuff that you need to function appropriately as an adult. All right, so that will sort of conclude our short little lecture here. Please progress to the next stage in the class, guys. I hope you're enjoying it. We'll see you online.